Content warning. This episode contains discussion of violence, rape, and murder.
You probably saw the same stories and headlines we did. A few weeks ago, James Lewis, the prime suspect in the 1982 Tylenol murders, died at the age of 76 in Cambridge, Massachusetts.
That case has always haunted us. 7 people died as the result of cyanide someone placed into Tylenol capsules. The poisonings were seemingly random. No one has ever been charged in the case.
Lewis came on the radar of investigators early on. He actually sent a letter to Johnson & Johnson, the manufacturers of Tylenol, in which he claimed he would put an end to the poisoning deaths in return for a payment of $1 million. While he admitted writing that note, he always denied committing the Tylenol murders. Despite that, there seemed to be a considerable amount of circumstantial evidence which indicated that Lewis could have been the killer.
And now, of course, he is dead. What does that mean for the case? To find out, we turned to Christy Gutowski and Stacy St. Clair, 2 terrific investigative reporters from the Chicago Tribune. In our opinion, the 2 of them have done by far the best and most extensive work on this complex and fascinating case. If you want a deep dive into this story, we highly recommend their podcast, Unsealed. It offers information on this case no one had gotten before. We will link to the series in our show notes.
We spoke with them last year for an overview of the case, and we will link to that episode in our show notes. But today, we wanted to talk specifically about James Lewis, about his death, about why investigators suspected him in the first place, and also about the incident which many claim is a smoking gun moment, offering proof of his guilt.
My name is Anya Kane. I'm a journalist.
And I'm Kevin Greenlee. I'm an attorney.
We first connected while looking into the Burger Chef murders, an Indiana cold case. Together, we built a spreadsheet documenting hundreds of cases of restaurant-related homicides. That original spreadsheet gave way to our podcast, The Murder Sheet.
Now we maintain that same research-centric, investigative approach as we look into all sorts of homicides, including unsolved cases, historical crimes, and, of course, restaurant murders.
We don't just chat about the headlines. Our podcast is a platform for our journalism. The Murder Sheet focuses on investigative reporting, thoughtful analysis, thorough research, and in-depth interviews. We're the Murder Sheet.
And this is the Tylenol Murders, Unsealed's Christy Gutowski and Stacy St. Clair on the death of suspect James Lewis.
I want to start off just sort of jumping into this topic and just by complimenting you, because this is one heck of a lead that you just wrote as part of the breaking coverage on James Lewis's death. James Lewis, the lone suspect in the 1982 Tylenol murders, was found dead Sunday at his home in suburban Boston, making it unlikely anyone will ever be charged in connection with the poisonings that killed 7 people and caused a worldwide panic. First of all, incredible lead. So my compliments. But I guess just talk to us about how you got this news and then how you ran with it.
So he died. The call came into police at 4 p.m. Eastern time, Sunday on July 9th. And that was basically a month before he would have turned 77. And we knew that he had a history of some health problems. He had a stroke, according to our sources, sometime within the last year or two. And then when he was in federal prison for the attempted extortion, he, or just before he went to prison, I believe it was in the mid 80s, he had some sort of a heart attack. So we knew that there was some health problems there, but, we last saw him less than a year ago, and he was kind of running down the street trying to get away from us. So he seemed in good enough health. And we knew that he had an active lifestyle. So we got a tip from a neighbor. One of his neighbors tipped us off that I think there's some activity in his unit, that we see the police are here, and there was some fire and rescue. And the neighbor said, shortly later, that he was deceased. So we were able to confirm. First, we called our law enforcement sources in Illinois, and they didn't know about it. So we told them, and they said, we'll find out from Cambridge PD. And then we were able to confirm through them first. Them confirming state police got involved and called Cambridge PD, and then Arlington Heights Police Department got involved, Suburban, and they confirmed it. And then we also got Cambridge to confirm it. So we had a story online, Stace, maybe by sometime after 9 p.m. Central Time. But I can't speak for Stacy, but I was a bit shocked. I thought that based on the man I saw less than a year ago, I thought that he was going to be around for a while.
I wasn't shocked, because Christy, from the beginning of this project, kept saying to me, time is not a friend to a homicide detective. So, and we lost somebody during the reporting, Charlie Ford, one of the detectives, and we both commented, like, this is the problem with the case, right? Memory is being lost, valuable sources of information are being lost, and now the only suspect anymore, there were some early on, but the only suspect at this point has died. So there's no closure in this case.
Absolutely. You mentioned him being the only suspect. And I want to stress for listeners who may not be so familiar with the case. I mean, is it fair to call James Lewis in 2023 the prime suspect in the Tylenol murders? Absolutely.
It was confirmed by lead law enforcement in the case. Stacy and I actually are, and I'm sure you guys as reporting partners, we talked about the words to use, lone versus prime. And certainly there were other suspects early in the investigation, but for a very long time, but for, even within months of the murders themselves, he has been the prime and lone suspect of law enforcement. There's been talk of tunnel vision through the years, but we uncovered other leads and other suspects, and we actually reviewed the records where they tracked it down. But there's really never been anyone except James William Lewis on law enforcement's radar. They are convinced that he is the Tylenol killer.
In your article, authorities say that they had a chargeable circumstantial case against him. So why didn't they ever charge him?
As everyone knows, police can't charge cases, only prosecutors do. And there were some problems with the case, right? They could never place Lewis in Chicago during the 3-day span. They think the pills were put on the shelf. That's because we don't leave, in 1982, we didn't leave the digital fingerprint that we leave today. And also because it's a gamble, right? And after 40 years, it's a big risk for a prosecutor, which is an elected position in Illinois, to take the chance, right? Like if, one investigator told me this week, well, if they won, it was going to be a 1-day story. But if they lost, it would be a multi-day story, just because the cost and the sort of the public nature of the loss. So it's a risk reward assessment.
And legally, it would have been difficult, right? You have 40 years of evidence. And Stacy and I uncovered floods and police basements. I mean, this was before things were even electronic, and missing things. So there would have been some issues with discovery that would have been difficult. And we know this is a jurisdiction issue, right? So you had victims who died in Cook County and DuPage County. So the two prosecutors who could have brought a prosecution, a trial, would have been Bob Berlin in DuPage and Kim Fox in Cook. And we know both of these politicians, public servants, and Berlin is extremely careful and cautious and wants everything buttoned up. And is he one to take on a circumstantial case without much direct? They had physical evidence, but no direct physical evidence. So there were meetings throughout the year that we reported on, but the last substantial thing to happen in this case was last September, when on the eve of our investigation, they flew out to Boston and re-interviewed him for several hours. But it's pretty much dried up since then. Our investigative sources told us there's been very little action. So it did not look probable that Berlin and Fox, she's on her way out and she's got all sorts of, problems in her office and things going on with Chicago violence. It didn't look probable that they were going to bring a prosecution. But still, our investigative sources were pretty upset that he died. Not that he died, but that he didn't die in prison.
Yeah, I was floored by some of the quotes that you got for the article. I mean, geez.
So were we.
Yeah, that was amazing. A retired FBI special agent, Roy Lane, saying James Lewis's death ends a lifetime of cruelty to others and a compulsive need for revenge. His death puts the pursuit of justice to an end. That's a jaw-dropping quote. And I'm wondering if we could unpack this. You spoke with so many investigative sources, and you know what this meant to them. And, maybe just looking at this from the perspective of, what this means to law enforcement who investigated what this death means, but also this lifetime of cruelty, if we can start getting into Lewis's background.
Quickly to the point of what it meant to investigators, his death, for many of them, they've been on this case in some way for 40 years, right? This is, I know the Moby Dick analogies are overused, but this was their white whale. And he toyed with them, right? He didn't just go on and lead a quiet life. They felt he was a continuing threat, mostly because around 2004, he was charged with drugging, kidnapping, and raping his neighbor in a business dispute. And they felt that, one FBI agent, the FBI agent in charge of Chicago, Rob Grant, told us, I think he's a threat to society as long as he's out there. He's a convicted con man. He ran a credit card scheme. We know that he tried, at the very least in Tylenol, to profit, or to not personally profit, but he injected himself with a very cruel attempted extortion. And we know in 1978, he was charged with murder of a tax client. His fingerprints were found in the attic of the home. And he did not go to trial in that case because there was a Miranda rights violation. So he's a man who does have a history of being accused of cruelty at the very least.
And also found in that attic was the body of the man who died.
Good point.
We are so grateful to our wonderful sponsor, Brilliant Earth. Brilliant Earth is all about gorgeous, fine jewelry and a strong commitment to ethical business practices in the diamond industry.
As a married couple, Kevin and I understand how a special ring can serve as a token of love. And Brilliant Earth creates some of the most beautiful engagement rings and wedding bands out there to celebrate your unique love story. Check out their website and customize the ring that you and your partner will love forever. They have all sorts of wonderful styles, like elegant solitaires or free-spirited willows. But you can also completely customize your ring, imbuing it with your own personality.
No one wants to have their special wedding or engagement ring tainted by worries over unethical diamond sourcing. What really shines for us about Brilliant Earth is their commitment to ethical sourcing and sustainability. That level of focus is an absolute rarity in the jewelry business. It makes us feel like we're supporting a brand that really cares about making the world a better place.
Now, Brilliant Earth only works with beyond conflict-free diamonds. That means they exclusively work with partners who follow the strictest international labor, trade, and environmental standards. So you know that they are committed to ensuring safe working conditions and a spirit of sustainability.
Check out all of their beautiful pieces at brilliantearth.com. That's brilliantearth.com. This episode is brought to you by BetterHelp.
We're grateful for our wonderful sponsor, BetterHelp. Kevin and I are night owls, and we often take that to extremes. Even though we know getting plenty of rest is good for our minds and bodies, sometimes we have trouble settling down, and we'll end up staying up way too late as a result. Sometimes it feels like our restless minds are actively sabotaging us. We know what we have to do, but our brains are getting in their own way.
If you can relate to that, then consider this. Therapy can help us all learn positive coping skills, far more positive than staying up researching random stuff all night. Therapy can really help you figure stuff out, so your brain can work for you instead of against you. It helps you strive to become a better version of yourself.
We'd encourage any of our listeners thinking about trying out therapy to give BetterHelp a try. It's all online. Even if you're super busy, BetterHelp is totally convenient to your schedule. And it's easy to get started. Just fill out a quick questionnaire and get matched with a licensed therapist.
BetterHelp will help you find the best match, and you can switch therapists whenever you want for no additional charge.
Make your brain your friend with BetterHelp. Visit betterhelp.com/murdersheet today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/murdersheet.
Yeah, it's a real legacy of violence, or at least, accusations of violence. And of course, we're reporters, not psychologists. We can't really, get too much into that. But at the same time, given your expertise on this case and how much you've delved into Lewis's history, what did you uncover that may shed some light about why this man was the way he was, or how one person ended up attracting so many accusations of truly heinous acts?
Yeah, so we were able to get some psychological assessments done of him ahead of his probation or his sentencing for the credit card fraud that he committed in the early 80s. And basically, they told a story of somebody with a very traumatic childhood. He was abandoned by both parents by the age of 2, along with his siblings. And when I mean abandoned, his mother left them in a hotel as small children by themselves to fend for themselves. Authorities didn't realize these children were living by themselves until the older sister was caught stealing milk for her siblings. He was adopted by a seemingly nice couple. There were no outward signs of trouble until he was 19 years old, when authorities said he had attempted suicide. And after his then stepfather found him, he demanded access to his stepfather's gun cabinet. And when his mother and stepfather, his adopted father had passed away, when his parents denied him access to the gun cabinet, he attacked them with an axe and was placed in a state mental hospital for a significant amount of time. He later told a judge that none of that was true, that his family made that story up, even though he was charged with attacking his parents. The family made the story up so he could avoid the Vietnam draft. And his probation officer said, that's just an example of how delusional this man is. He had a history of vengeance and revenge. There's stories of him. His mother ended up not leaving her home to him. She left it to a cousin, and then he distributed flyers for a KKK rally on the cousin's front yard, sort of like a very early form of doxing, and he, threatened people who he thought had done him wrong, and to the point where they believe that that he was angry at Johnson & Johnson. That's one of the reasons why investigators believe he committed the murders.
And it was his own personality, his own psychology, having to be the smartest. He's quite intelligent, very gifted artist. But it was really his own psychology, his own he inserted himself into this investigation when he was, besides the extortion letter, when he was awaiting sentencing in federal court after being convicted by a federal jury of attempted extortion. He inserted himself into it by contacting, who does this, right? You're the lead suspect in an investigation. You contact the lead FBI agent and say, I didn't do it, but I'm so smart, I can help you figure out who did do it, and draws all these elaborate drawings that Stacy and I interviewed the FBI's feasibility expert, who said that, yes, this is feasible. This is how you could definitely get cyanide in the capsules. So he played this cat and mouse game with authorities for decades. And I find that so fascinating and if you believe in criminal profiling, which some people do not, but the profilers in this case said that the killer is going to be someone who is going to do this. They're going to come to you when maybe the headlines start drying up and inserting themselves and, saying, I can help you. And, authorities believe that that's what happened here.
Yeah, it's like that need for attention. And it's very like out of fiction, because the whole toying with investigators and inserting oneself into the case just is really is pretty baffling. I guess, in terms of, you mentioned the revenge against Johnson and Johnson. It sounds like he was almost like a grievance collector, where he's going around collecting grievances from different, instances. But with Johnson and Johnson, can you talk a bit about the event that maybe set him on a collision course with that specific company?
Yeah. So the investigators' theory is that, although in 1974, his only child, Tony, died, she had Down syndrome and a heart defect, and they used sutures to close a hole in her heart. And those sutures tore, and she died. And in the aftermath of when he came forward, as Christy described, the FBI did look for, is there a connection to Johnson & Johnson? And in 1982, it came up empty-handed. When the case reopened in 2007, investigators went back to Kansas City. They read her post-mortem report, and they saw that the sutures that were torn were a brand called Ethicon. And Ethicon is a subsidiary of Johnson & Johnson, just like Tylenol is a subsidiary of Johnson & Johnson. So their working theory is that he was so upset about his daughter's death that he blamed Johnson & Johnson, and this was his act of revenge. Now, we also know that he signed that extortion letter with his wife's former employer's name and his wife's former employer checking account, because he wanted to put the former employer in the FBI's crosshairs too. So they believe it was sort of this like double revenge plot, both against his wife's, 2 for 1. You get the wife's employer and you get Johnson & Johnson. And if you look at his website, cyberlewis.com, for however much longer it's up, he does have rants against Johnson & Johnson and Ethicon specifically. Now, lots of Johnson & Johnson rants, but there are specific Ethicon rants. So the idea that he has had a problem with Johnson & Johnson certainly is backed up by his website a bit.
I'm also curious, the wife in all this, James Lewis's wife, where does she fit into in this story?
So Leanne Lewis married him in 1969, and Stacy mentioned they had a child who died young in life. And but for his stint in federal prison for nearly 13 years, and then some separation for a short period during the 2004 rape allegations, she has been by his side. And he, when he got out of federal prison, he moved into her Cambridge condominium, where she still lives today. And she has never been convicted of any wrongdoing. There was some minor warrant issues back in 1982, 83, when they were, getting them, trying to find them. But all allegations were dropped. She's never been accused of any wrongdoing with the Tylenol case. And, investigators have their theories when it comes to what she knew and what she didn't know. But Lewis has said that he told her after he wrote that extortion letter that she didn't even know about that. So we know that she took lie detector tests early on voluntarily in the investigation. And then we know that, it's interesting when I saw him when we chased after him last year, he was wearing a I Heart My Awesome Wife t-shirt. So, I think that they were, constant companions and made it through decades of insane media exposure and law enforcement knocking on their doors and constant. And so she stood by him through all of that. We know that she was out of town when he died. She was visiting family in the Midwest. And when she couldn't get a hold of him, she had a friend go check on him. And that friend who lived nearby found him deceased, no signs of suspicion, according to authorities, and called 911. So that's what we know about her.
Can you tell us something about the calendar wrinkle involving Agent Lane?
Sure, we can tell this one together, make sure we get it right. So in 2007, the FBI reopened the case, or decided to take a second look at the case. It had gone grown cold by then. As part of that, they brought Roy Lane, who was sort of a legendary FBI agent in the Chicago area, and he had worked on the original Tylenol investigation. In fact, he's the person that Jim Lewis called and offered to help solve the murders, as we just talked about a little bit ago. So he comes out of retirement, and there's this scheme that Roy knows author, quote unquote, who's working on a Tylenol book. And Roy and this author no longer think Jim Lewis is the killer. And will Jim Lewis help them prove his innocence? And Jim Lewis jumps at the chance, right? Because he loves the attention. He loves, thinking he's pulling one past people, according to Roy. And they go through a series of traveling around. They go to Kansas City. They go at one point to Chicago, and they visit the Walgreens where Paula Prince bought her tampered Tylenol. And so they're in a hotel room in Chicago. And what Lewis doesn't know is that technology they didn't know when the letter was mailed initially. And what Lewis doesn't realize is they've since developed technology to remove the ink on the postage stamp layer by layer until they show that it's been postmarked October 1st. And the killings happened on the 29th. And Lewis has been told a story that it took 3 days for him to write that letter. And because he wanted to make it sound like a fourth grader had written it, he had to do some, research and whatnot. And so Roy tells him about the postmark, and he repeats, it took me 3 days. And Roy takes out a calendar, he takes out a folder and draws the calendar. And he shows Lewis, it can't be right, because if Lewis had taken 3 days to write the letter, he was writing the letter before or as people were dying. And Christy can tell you, Lewis's reaction is very telling.
He was seated on a couch in the hotel room, and he has a messenger bag over, strapped over his chest and his shoulder. And keep in mind, he'd been saying it took me at least 3 days since 1982, when he's meeting with them and saying, I'll help you solve 83. I'll help you solve these killings. And, they got him on record back then talking about at least 3 days. I think he even said longer sometimes. And that's how he does things. He's and all these letters that he's written through the years. He was a prolific writer when he was on the lam. He wrote to all the media, Kansas, Chicago. He wrote to the Tribune many times. He always writes things over and over until he gets them perfect. And he wants it, when he wrote a threatening letter to Ronald Reagan. He talked about how he intentionally made it be like an eighth grader intellect so that like it would throw them off. So this is his MO. So they caught him in that. And so they used his words against him now. And you could see his body, it tenses up and he clutches that messenger. The body language is so telling. He clutches that body bag to his chest and says, well, it must have been mistaken, faulty memory. I must have been mistaken. So people have asked us before, what's the smoking gun in this case? And, Stacy and I as well went into this as blank slates and wanted to be skeptical. And, did they have tunnel vision? Is it Lewis? Was it Roger Arnold, another viable suspect back in the day? And investigators really described this as more of a puzzle than a smoking gun. If there was a smoking gun for Stacy and I believe it was that video that we watched, an undercover FBI video from an uncharged case. But this really is a puzzle. And there are so many pieces, like Stacy mentioned that they went back to that Walgreens where victim Paula Prince bought it. Well, he says to them, this is like deja vu. I'm getting, and maybe he's just messing with them. But then they go into the Walgreens, and according to law enforcement, he walks straight back to where the Tylenol was shelved in 1982. It's not there anymore. But back in the day, it was shelved in a back shelving unit. And he goes to that area where there's something else now. So that's another piece of the puzzle. And there are several others we can go into. But I guess for Stacy and I, that video was among the most compelling evidence that we saw that James William Lewis could in fact be the Tylenol killer.
Yeah, it just sounds like, I don't know, to me, we always say on our show, like prosecutors should not charge cases like on a lark. It's like such a serious, commitment of, treasure and also, possible re-traumatizing, victims and witnesses and whatnot. But this sounds like they had a circumstantial case against the man. You probably don't want to get too much into your own opinions on charging versus not charging, but like, do you think that was ultimately the right call for these Chicago area prosecutors to not go for charges, given that would have turned out to have been their last shot to do so?
So in Unsealed, our podcast, we did not draw that conclusion. We didn't feel it was our place. The conclusion we made was that if you're not going to charge it, release the records to the victims' families and loved ones so they can have a full accounting and they can make the decision. They can see the results of lie detector tests and they could read sealed, affidavits and read all of Jim Lewis's writings and words. Like they found all these writings in which if I were the killer, this is how I did it. And he said that was for a manuscript, but like they can allow these poor souls to read everything and the public who's invested so much. This case is international attention. I mean, people cared. A 12-year-old little girl died. She was an only child. If you go to her mother's Facebook page, it's as if it happened yesterday. Her sorrow and suffering is palpable. So that was the conclusion we drew.
I'd like to jump back from that quote we mentioned earlier from Roy Lane. He said, Lewis's death puts the pursuit of justice to an end. Is that true? How does his death affect the investigation to this case?
I think it is true. And Roy's saying it on the record. He's extremely close to this case still today. He's obviously after Lewis, he would be the star witness to tell this story, right? He's the only, he and Jeremy Margolis are probably the only two people who have the entire 40-year history of the case. And both of them believe that it's over. Everything they've done for 39 years, since basically 1983, everything they've done has been in pursuit of charging Jim Lewis. So absent some advance in DNA technology, which we know is possible. We've seen it in our lifetimes, right? Or a confession from somebody else. I don't see how anybody else could ever be charged with this when you would have the reasonable doubt in the case against James Lewis right there for anyone to hold up. So I don't see them going down some new path.
I would agree with Stacy. We all know as journalists, we've covered cases like the Kevin Fox case, for example, where it, it sure seemed like prosecutors had all their ducks in a row, and the person, we've seen false confessions. And so you never say never, right? You always, if someone were to come forward or some DNA, I mean, they're still doing forensic testing and things. If they were to find something out, and we see it all the time, right? With, especially with the use of, ancestry.com, things that they could prove it, that it was somebody else. And I don't know that I'd be shocked. I don't know that Stacy would be shocked, because as journalists, you always keep an open mind. But it seems unlikely.
Yeah. They don't have a DNA profile right now that they can't match or identify. They did a lot of going back to the first responders and the scientists who handled the pills and the bottles and such. And so they can account for every fully identifiable profile on the evidence. There are some partial profiles that maybe with an advancement of DNA, you could extract more later on, but extract more of a profile, not more of a sample, but extract more of a profile later on. But right now, the DNA is a dead end.
I will say that even in death, James Lewis is still controversial. They weren't going to do an autopsy, local authorities in the Boston area, because there was just no signs of foul play. It was a man with a history of heart problems, a senior citizen. But Illinois law enforcement, particularly the state police, the DuPage County State's Attorney's Office, pushed to have an autopsy done. And we're told the Massachusetts state medical examiner's office has now accepted the case, and there will be one, because, you never know. We asked Illinois law enforcement, who only spoke on the condition of anonymity, why? And they're like, well, what if there's cyanide found in his body? What if it is, what if, coulda, there's a lot of that. But they just want to, if it's truly this James Lewis lead is dead, finally, after 40 years of all kinds of crazy twists and turns, they want to dot that I and cross that T and make sure that there's no possibility of any suspicion of surrounding his death, even though local law enforcement's not necessary, but okay.
Right. They want to make absolutely sure. I know in the article, one family member of one of the victims is quoted as saying that they believe that law enforcement got tunnel vision around Lewis. Is that a common conception amongst the various surviving family members of these victims, or do most of them tend to think that Lewis was the man?
I don't think that specific statement is a common conception. I think there's a lot of unknowns among the victims' family members. They haven't been privy to a lot of the information. A lot of them learned stuff from the first time from our series and our podcasts. I think they've had so many false hopes over the years that they just don't know what to believe and what to follow. I'm sure you've seen that in your own reporting,
Oh yeah. And that lack of those lack of answers can be very difficult, I know, for family members, because closure is not really a thing oftentimes, and it's not going to bring anyone back. But knowing what happened can be, I think, comforting in some ways. I'm curious, for both of you, doing so much in-depth reporting on this story, are there any sort of memorable reporting moments that come up for you both when you're thinking about, looking into the James Lewis lead and this whole story as a whole?
Well, for me, I think it's when we saw the undercover FBI video. Christy and I have been, we've worked together our entire lives. So to see that together was a special moment for me, because you guys know, it's never happened to me in my career. I don't think it's ever happened to Christy, where someone's like, here, there's no indictment, but I'll show you this, undercover FBI video. And that was a pretty powerful moment. We got back in the car afterwards, and we're just like, did we just see what we like let's take a moment as journalists and stop and think about what we just had access to. So I think kind of professionally and personally, that was a fun moment to share because I got to share it with Christy on top of everything.
I agree with Stacy, and I think she'd agree with me on a couple other highlights. Professionally, whenever you can figure something out is always a great moment. And I have such admiration for Stacy as a person, as a professional. And I got a tip that they exhumed a former suspect, Roger Arnold's body, and it was a tip from a primary law enforcement source who was there when they exhumed the body. But editors. They want documents, and Stacy's a FOIA expert and a military expert, and he was a veteran. And she knew that taxpayers pay for our veterans' cemeteries, so she was able to FOIA and work with the FOIA officer, and she got a copy of that sealed exhumation order, long sealed in the court. So we were able to tell the public this happened. So that professionally was a really big moment for me because it was a pairing of our particular skills, and it was a proud moment. And then personally, I guess I'm a bit of a geek, but I always find like inspiration in human beings, like at like the most difficult times in their life, how people, the inner strength that they have. And it's always an honor to watch that as somebody who is a documenter of life, and to watch these law enforcement who, they would share pictures of us when they were rookies and then show us firefighters, law enforcement, and the families and the friends and the coworkers. They've aged, and you saw the progression on them, but within 5 minutes of talking, the tears started. Or the long retired law enforcement who got like the yellowed banker's box of yellow documents out of their basement and said, "This is the one I took with me after 300 cases," or, so it's always something to document humanity and people caring and trying to help. And this is not one that unfortunately led to any answers or a successful prosecution. But I just thought that there was tremendous beauty and resilience in their efforts.
Absolutely. That's so well said. And, kind of to draw a contrast with that, I guess, can you tell us about, the last years of James Lewis's life? You mentioned that he may have run away from you at some point. Can you tell us more about that?
Stacy interviewed a friend of his, so she can speak a bit more into his day-to-day life. We know that, his wife was a successful accounting, billing. She has successful business. They live in like a condominium in a beautiful area of Cambridge that, I think when we last checked, his assessment was, worth more than $500,000. So it's not like, he was some pauper. I know that he ran businesses out of his home, and they had a circle of friends, and were known in the community. So I don't think he lived hard up or, financially destitute. He did have the media pestering him, so that was probably his biggest. And then he obviously wasn't in good health. Yeah.
So he got out of jail when they dropped the rape charges in 2007. And he started working on a book called Poisoned, ! A Doctor's Dilemma. And you can still get it on Amazon. I don't recommend. I really struggled to read it, but it opens with a doctor testifying in a poisoning trial in a Chicago courtroom, the exact courtroom that he was tried for the attempted extortion case. And it's about a doctor that has to find someone who's poisoning water systems as an act of revenge against government. And the doctor is from Joplin, Missouri, who is also where Jim Lewis is from. And the doctor is a genius, and which Jim Lewis fancied himself, and good looking and charming and all these things. And his name is Chuck Rivers, and Lewis lived on the Charles River, near the Charles River in Boston. So it's a very interesting read in that respect, and probably only in that respect.
Yeah. Sounds like a self-insert for sure.
Yeah.
Wow.
The morning I encountered him was last August, and he was going to pick up a rental car, a zip car. Is that what they call it? A zip car. And he, he denied having anything to do with the poisonings, and complained about being hounded. How would you feel being hounded for 40 years for something you didn't do? And took a swipe at Johnson & Johnson, and how the investigation was flawed because their scientists and employees were allowed to do a lot of the testing on all the tens of thousands of capsules and bottles that were recovered, and clearly did not like having his picture taken. We believe it was the first time in perhaps a decade that he had been photographed publicly, and he hadn't spoken publicly in nearly a decade. So we were happy to get him the short time that we did. And, he had grown out his beard and his hair. He looked, I almost thought he might've been trying to disguise himself because he knew the 40th anniversary was approaching. He looked quite different than neighbors described to us how he would have looked. And we interviewed a friend of his who described how he would have looked. So that was the last time we saw him.
Then in terms of what's next for you both, in terms of reporting, this story or other stories, sort of do you have any things to hint at that, you have coming up with this, or, kind of questions that you still might have the opportunity to get answered for the public and the families?
I think we thought this case was done because we didn't think there were going to be charges. So I think now we're committed to keep finding as much information and making as much information public as possible, both for, as Christy said, the victims' families, and for a public that has been affected by this case and has funded this case really for 40 years. So the public deserves to know how their government operates, as I'm sure we all on this call agree. So we'll keep fighting for information.
Awesome. Well, yeah, keep fighting the good fight. We definitely always support the disclosure of more public documents. As to go on a soapbox, the taxpayers are funding these investigations, and I think once a suspect is dead and the investigation, is therefore never going to result in a prosecution, then it seems like it's good sense to at least make that public so people can view that and see what happened.
Agreed.
Awesome. Well, listen, Stacy and Christy,
thank you so much.
Thank you so much. We so respect your journalism and your commitment to this case, and all that you've been able to uncover through it. And we so appreciate you giving us the time to chat about this latest update with us.
We're so happy to be here.
Thank you so much.
We would like to thank Christy and Stacy for talking with us, and again want to tell you how great their podcast is on this case. It is called Unsealed, and we highly recommend it. We would also highly recommend their reporting for the Chicago Tribune.
Thanks so much for listening to The Murder Sheet. If you have a tip concerning one of the cases we cover, please email us at murdersheet@gmail.com. If you have actionable information about an unsolved crime, please report it to the appropriate authorities.
If you're interested in joining our Patreon, that's available at www.patreon.com/murdersheet. If you want to tip us a bit of money for records requests, you can do so at www.buymeacoffee.com/murdersheet. We very much appreciate any support.
Special thanks to Kevin Tyler Greenlee, who composed the music for The Murder Sheet, and who you can find on the web at kevintg.com.
If you're looking to talk with other listeners about a case we've covered, you can join the Murder Sheet discussion group on Facebook. We mostly focus our time on research and reporting, so we're not on social media much. We do try to check our email account, but we ask for patience as we often receive a lot of messages. Thanks again for listening.